talking about Timothy Keller, Russell Moore, other evangelical elites, how they got Christians, how they went after evangelicals to vote Democrat.
Right.
One quick note, wanted to add on this. Maybe you've never heard of Timothy Keller or Russell Moore, for example. You would say, I don't know who these guys are. I've never read a book by them. Who are they, and why should I care, would be the bigger question. The way these kind of platforms work is that maybe you've never heard their name, but your pastor, for example, say your pastor balked over COVID or balked over Trump. He was probably listening to these guys. Right. Timothy Keller's influence, he's sold millions of books. It's almost diffused, and so their ideas and their thoughts and their ethics, they get absorbed to where they're almost the zeitgeist of the moment. Mm-hmm. They're almost, taken for granted because they're so influential.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, that's good. With the power thing, one of the things I wanted to note is even, with this episode, we are going to address that topic at least at some level, because what's interesting is that, a lot of the modern day evangelical elites, they want you, the plebe, to give up power. Mm-hmm. But notice Russell Moore and Tim Keller, and Francis Collins and these guys, they're not leading by example. They're telling you to give up power, but they very much are wielding power. They have immense power, immense influence, and they're wielding all of it as much as they can in terms of influence and platform, but also in terms of dollars, and we'll get into that, funding, money, in order to secure a certain outcome, namely that evangelicals would vote for Democrats. So, and Tim Keller, he's got his, he has an explanation where he said, well, I was registered as a Democrat for these reasons, but it is public knowledge. You can look it up. He's passed away at this point, but he was registered publicly as a Democrat. And he has his explanation for that. I don't find it incredibly convincing, but you'd be surprised. Some of the major evangelical leaders, Tim Keller is not the only one, who are publicly registered as Democrats and have been for decades. So.
Yep. I feel like I should address too, on that note, I've had conversations with Christians who have said, why would you be so shocked and opposed to a Christian voting for a Democrat? Mm-hmm. And I think some of this mentality comes from, to be honest, I think it's a little bit uninformed, because the Democratic Party has from its beginning been a problem, a sinful problem of racism and anti-black freedom and segregationist, and also as far as even their monetary policies, I think were extremely misguided. But the Democrat, Republican, or the progressive conservative issues that we face now are clear moral issues. There's no way that we can say that voting for baby killers or people who advocate removal of body parts from so-called transgender children, or totally open borders, abdicating duties of nations, these are obvious bright lines, right? Where there is a right and a wrong on each side of them. And so in that sense, people need to realize that the political issues that we face are not really political issues. Right. They are spiritual issues that are manifesting themselves in polls and elections, but they're clearly spiritual, moral, black and white issues.
Yep, absolutely. Of influential evangelical leaders are meeting together in person, right? Like almost like this regular, lodge or something,
they term themselves the outsiders. They outliers. They had a name and everything.
Outliers? What is it? Okay. And so, they had a name for their group. They're meeting in person. Russell Moore, it seems like, was brought in a little bit later, but he became a part of the group. But the implication is that Tim Keller and Francis Collins and some of these other guys, what was the name of the dude with the New York?
David Brooks is columnist for the New York Times.
Yep. Yeah.
So you're talking about when you think of the NIH, National Institutes of Health, of which Francis Collins was the director. Right. They have a $40 billion budget. So you have a massive government influence. David Brooks, New York Times columnist, massive traditional legacy media influence, one of the best-selling apologists and authors in Christendom, on the Presbyterian side especially, Timothy Keller. On the Baptist side, Russell Moore, other attendees. And the date of it...
Because at that time, Russell Moore was still SBC, head of the ERLC.
Yes, he was head of their ethics commission. they're meeting in 2015. Now, Trump didn't, of course, so we're in 2024 election year. We haven't even had any primaries yet. We don't know who will be the nominee. We have a good guess. I think you could warrant a guess for who it'll be. So they're meeting before Trump has even stood in a single primary. And what they're meeting about. So Bernie Sanders is a self-avowed, self-described Democratic socialist. He was on the ballot. Hillary Clinton, not a fan. Not a fan of evangelicals, not friendly to their policies. They're looking to be the next front runners up for the Democratic Party. So you had 2 years of Barack Obama, who he billed himself as a moderate. He tacked hard left. He tried to bill himself as this unifying, moderate, bring both sides together. He really wasn't that. So you had 2 years of really a pretty progressive president. I mean, 2015 was Obergefell versus Hodges, the legalization of same-sex marriage. So you had a rapid progressive influx of change, of cultural headwinds, 2015 going into 2016. And the object of their concern, what was it? Bernie Sanders, Clinton, no, it was Donald Trump. Somebody that had mean tweets on Twitter.
Possibly even not specifically Donald Trump, but a conservative backlash to the leftward direction that the country had been going. Because like you say, Trump wasn't necessarily the guy. So they're already meeting saying, what are we going to do? How are we going to push the evangelical vote towards a more progressive mindset?
Yes. Right. And this is coming off, this is during and then towards the end of 2 terms of Obama.
Correct.
So they're watching one of the most, or the most progressive president in American history. And they're saying, and their takeaway is not, we're concerned about this. Their takeaway is, we're concerned that this might stop.
Yep.
We're concerned that some ultra conservative guy might, come in or whatever. So they're like, how can we stay in this?
What's going to happen to us as we steward the slow decline? Like these men, you can give your thoughts, but they almost seem like they're stewards. I think of the steward of Gondor.
Yep.
Right.
He was just holding the throne, not as a king, not to rule well, not to see a renewal, literally just to manage it slowly.
Abandon your post.
Yep. And then it comes down to it.
Yep.
Abandon ship.
Yep.
That's what these men almost remind me of. The ship is going out on the west. The sun is sinking. We're entering, it's probably going to be a tough couple, not just years, but decades ahead. And it looks like these men just wanted to keep the status quo above everything else. Not someone to change it up. Not someone to flip the table, even if it has some negatives. They just wanted to manage the slow decline of both evangelicalism. I mean, Russell Moore, he said, let cultural Christianity die. But what a dumb thing to say. And what I want to get across, not all of them, but many of them, they hate the church.
Yeah.
And in a sense, God's people, they love nothing more than selling them out. I think of David French with the New York Times. He's getting his thousands of dollars to write against good, salt of the earth Christians, to sell them out, to put them on blast, to make them look silly. These people don't love God's church. They don't love him. They don't love his people.
Yep. And when it becomes so obvious that they can't even deny the ways that they have harmed Christians throughout, the entirety of the country, it's there's not deep repentance, there's not deep remorse, there's not sorrow, there's not a sense of oh my goodness, I hurt the people of God who I love. Right? David says, speaking of the saints, he says they are the excellent ones in all the earth, in whom my soul delights. He delights in the people of God, he loves them. But Francis Collins, recently, the reaction is not godly sorrow leading to repentance and deep remorse for how you hurt the people of God. The reaction is, whoops. Turns out, we were thinking about how COVID would affect, New York City, that's densely populated and these kinds of things. We didn't think about, Ohio. We didn't think about Kansas. We didn't think about, we weren't thinking about rural areas, and turns out, but here's the thing. It's you weren't thinking about it, but there were hundreds of people that were, and we screamed
we were saying so.
at you, and you heard us. You looked us in the face. You heard. You knew, and we know because that you heard what we were saying because you mocked us and told us to shut up and deleted the emails and ran a campaign against us. And but plenty of people did. So you weren't thinking about this. Well, plenty of people were, and they put it on your radar to where you were thinking about it and you didn't care because at the end of the day. That blue collar conservative salt of the earth Christian in Kansas doesn't matter as much as the person in New York City in your mind, right? These are people who they love the chief seats and they love the people who can put them in the chief seats. Flyover country doesn't matter to them. because these are just, Neanderthals, as Joe Biden said, like our president. I mean, that like they hate you. They hate the salt of the earth, blue collar Christian. And, back to the conspiracy type thing, like, maybe we'll get into the Illuminati one day, but I think it's absolutely hits home, right? It's absolutely something that's right on the nose and relevant for us as Christians and our families, our wives, our children, our local churches to talk about. Maybe not the Illuminati, but sadly the evangelical version of it, a group that literally has a name that meets in person and did so for years during Obama's 2 terms and says, this is not our big concern. Our big concern is this stopping with Orange Man Bad because he has mean tweets. And how can we leverage our influence, not just ours, but with Francis Collins and and the New York Times and how can we leverage all cash, money, influence, books, sermons, conferences, the whole 9 yards to keep going in a political direction that murders babies, that eventually will trans kids, and that's what we should focus on.
To me, in 2008, WEF in Davos, they invited Rick Warren to go and speak, and Rick Warren started his talk by saying something along the lines of, "There are these great issues that humanity faces that no single nation has been able to tackle." And he listed pandemics, he listed poverty, he listed, economic inequity, things like this. And he said, because we haven't been able to tackle these to this point, it behooves us to partner together. And what he meant was international government forces, international business, and international religious movements. Okay? And this is what he said. He said, there is a role for the public sector. There's a role for the private sector. There was a role for the faith sector. And then he says the governments or the UN ought to set the policy for what needs to be tackled globally. Then he said the enterprise, the commerce, the business sector needs to kind of come up with new ingenious ideas of tackling problems. And then this is what he said the role of the church in this open post-war kind of global neighborhood world is. He says, but then also, houses of worship have things that businesses and government will never have. In the first place, we have universal distribution. The church was global 200 years before Davos started talking about globalization. And then he said, we have 2,000 years of credibility where we can tell our people to go do this because the government told us and they will believe us. He handed the WEF the credibility of the church and the goodwill of the regular average person sitting in the pew, the blue-collar Christian, and said, these are totally at your disposal. And if we wanted to, that was 2008. That was even before the Russell Moore. Yep, that was Rick Warren. It was Rick Warren.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah. Not shocked. Sad, but not shocked.
Yep.
All right. Wes, pick it back up with segment 2 now. Evangelical elite saw Trump as the biggest threat and the dark money funded years of propaganda. Let's get into some of that.
Yes. So 2016, Trump is elected. They did not just take their ball and go home. Well, we had a good run. We tried to dissuade the evangelical vote. They came out actually at a little bit stronger level than they had even in the past. And so it wasn't effective, at least in the short term. However, these initiatives, so aimed at educating evangelicals, aimed at persuading the vote, aimed at political engagement, they continued. And so 2020, obviously COVID happened. And what we actually see, Aaron Wren revealed this, is that Curtis Chang is a good example. He's an individual that's a consultant, David French. They began getting together and forming these initiatives. And what they did is they actually went to Christians, first of all.
They were looking for funding.
Right. They were looking for funding. They went to Christians and said, hey, could you fund this? We want to put
this
together.
This is David Chang, Russell Moore.
Curtis Chang, Russell Moore, and David French.
Curtis Chang.
They wanted to put together a curriculum for Christians. So go to Christians. Will you fund this? And they said, no, we're not interested in funding this. And so they actually went to the secular investors. Secular investors, he said, all of them said yes. Then you got into, obviously, COVID and the vaccines. Well, the government paid individuals, one of them being Curtis Chang and others, money, undisclosed sums, to put out videos to aim to convince communities of faith to get vaccinated. Another example of this, I lived in New Jersey at the time. I saw events. I have screenshots. There was these events being held called Grateful for the Shot. food, fun, games, vaccines. Being held at Hope of Dominion and Glory.
Vaccines administered at the site. The event?
So come to the site.
At a church?
Yes. Wow. Come to the site. Come to our church. Listen to some music. Play some games. We're grateful for the shot being paid by the New Jersey Department of Public Health to hold these events. And so we talked about influence, obviously, backroom 2015, but that continued to grow. And just 2020 election, there's a lot of issues with it. But I mean, Biden was elected, and it's not unthinkable to think that 5 years of telling Christians, this man is terrible, Trump is awful.
Of these evangelical leaders telling Christians.
Yes, right. These evangelical leaders telling Christians, Trump's terrible. Mm-hmm. How could you do this? How could you support him? That it finally saturated the ground enough that in 2020, at the very least, they stayed home. Maybe they voted against him. I'm sure many did. Mm-hmm. Or they at least stayed home. And now we see where we are.
And just didn't vote at all. Yeah, totally. Yep. Yeah, and that's not to mention, rigging an election and mail-in ballots and ballot harvesting and all. Yeah, exactly. And machines, just accidentally, saying, oh, this was a pile for Biden, So there's all those things as well. But aside from, the freest and safest and surest election of all time, absolutely. Like, let's just say that the election was 100%, legit, which, again, if you believe that, I've got a bridge I'd love to sell you. But let's say it's 100% legit. Well, just at a human level, Biden could have won by just by knocking out the evangelical voting bloc, or at least weakening its legs, hamstringing it. And who did that? Evangelical leaders, Russell Moore, guys, absolutely. And one more name to add to the list. Sadly, God's used him in many ways. I'm grateful for him, and I wouldn't put him in the same category as Russell Moore, Tim Keller, those guys. But John Piper, he should be mentioned. John Piper, one of the articles that he wrote. Before the election, right before the election. And so it was pivotal. I mean, he was trying to influence Christians to do something in regards.
Right before the election.
Yeah, it was right before the election. And John Piper has massive influence.
And he had stayed out of it the whole time.
Exactly. He was doing great. Yep. John Piper he really is great in a lot of ways. Terrible on politics, though. He's just bad on politics. He just needs to stay out. But he wrote this article right before the election. He has massive influence with a ton of Christians. And I just can't believe this didn't affect how at least some people voted. I bet you that some people, just like Wes said, either said, well, then I guess I'm just not going to vote at all, or I'm going to, vote for third party.
Too complicated.
Or I'm whatever. Or maybe even that was the nail in the coffin, like add that to, all the work that Russell Moore and Tim Keller have been doing. And we just conjured another Christian vote for Biden. The conscience, the Christian is sitting there, and knowing I can't vote for a guy who's the most pro-abortion president, of history. Like, surely I can't, but Tim Keller assuaging the conscience a little bit, Russell Moore assuaging the conscience, and then John Piper, and of all people, who's always been a defense of the unborn for decades, but then assuages the conscience, puts the finishing touches, and this is how he did it. He didn't do it by saying, abortion isn't bad. He didn't minimize the evils of abortion, but what he did was he, in my assessment, in this article, he wrongly maximized, increased the evils of a nasty Twitter account. And he put them on par. This was essentially, I'm summing up the article. This is not verbatim. It's not a quote. But in summary, I think this is fair. He said, we know that Biden's bad because we know abortion is bad. It's murder. And he didn't pull that punch. It's murder. And murder is really, really bad. But you know what else is bad? Arrogance, pride. And you know what? That's maybe harder to measure because we can look at exact numbers, annually of, through Planned Parenthood and through this and through that and see like how many babies have been killed, and it's maybe harder to quantify the effects of arrogance, but arrogance when it's in the highest office in the land, namely the Oval Office, and it's millions of people are seeing, your attitude and your rhetoric and your this, well, that could lend towards further division, and division could lend towards factions, and that could lend towards riots, and that could, and that can lend towards, this and that and the other, and all these negative effects, and you know what? That's really bad too. And he pretty much just left it there, and he didn't say, of course, he didn't say, so therefore, vote for Biden. He didn't say that, but the whole purpose of the article was it said we definitely shouldn't vote for Biden, but I'm here to tell you that there's just as much reason not to vote for Trump, and I guarantee you that a bunch of people that year just decided not to vote. Now, here's the gaping hole in Piper's argument. The gaping hole is what I would say is he created a false dichotomy, because what he's implying is this: on the one hand, you have murder; on the other hand, you have pride. But what that assumes is that there is actually such a thing as a humble murderer. That Joe Biden, because what he's assuming there is that Trump is arrogant, but here's the implication: he's arrogant and Biden is not. Right? So on the one hand, you have, and what's the absence of arrogance and pride? So you have a humble baby killer, and then you have a arrogant, prideful non-baby killer. And what I want to say is that you cannot be pro-abortion apart from pride. What radical arrogance. So all you're talking about at this point is not pride versus murder. Because there's no way that you can argue that the most pro-abortion president in our history is somehow humble. Yeah, right. You have to have pride to do that. It is by nature a prideful position. And so they're both prideful. All you're talking about is tone. But that works with evangelicals because that rhetoric had been worked for so many years by this point. The tone police, tone. Every gospel coalition, every other article, tone. Well, it's not what you said, but it's how you said it. It's your tone, it's your rhetoric, and so then Trump comes in and he's got an abrasive tone, I'll admit. And so boom, we were ready to say, you know what? We've got one president who kills babies and another who has bad tone on Twitter. And really, who's to say which is worse? And so black swan events they seem like they're random, but they're not. Just like COVID, it was not a coincidence that it was 2020. And so what do we foresee? We don't have a crystal ball. We're not prophets or the son of a prophet. So these are not predictions that we're putting our name on, saying this shall come to pass. Thus saith the Lord. None of that. But I do think that there's something to be said for just being wise and looking ahead. So we're looking ahead not as experts, but as generalists, and saying it's an election year. It's a heated, contested election. There's a lot on the line for the regime in both parties, because there, at some level there is just in our nation just at this point controlled opposition, right? The GOP, most of it is just controlled opposition underneath the overarching regime that's trying to plunge us into this global world, one world order that's just progressive, degenerate, lizard people. So that's, I think I acknowledge that. Trump, I don't even think, obviously he wouldn't be an elder in our church, but I don't even think he could be a member in our church. We believe in regenerate church membership. We're Baptist, 1689. And, I would sit down to him and talk to him. And I'm not saying God alone sees the heart. Man looks at the outward appearance. But from what I've seen, not only do I not think he's a mature Christian, I don't even know if I could say that he is a Christian at all. But all that said, one thing I like about Trump is that that I don't think that he's a part of the regime. I don't think he's the control. Trump was not supposed to happen. That's why they lost their minds in 2016. Is it was like this, like we for years, it was they gave us two options: the option we want and the option we don't want, but he's still our guy, right? You can have the progressive degenerate guy, or the guy who's conserving the progressive degenerate things that were done 15 minutes ago.
That's right.
But they're both actually our guys. They're both within the machine. And Trump, again, so this is not like Trump is some awesome godly guy. This is just to say he wasn't a part of the regime. And do I think he could have done more? Yes. But do I think he did more than any other Republican president in my lifetime? Also, yes. So all that being said, you got Trump right now as the forerunner for the primary with the GOP, and it's an election year. And we know what stunts they pulled last year with mail-in voting and ballot harvesting and all these things under the banner, of COVID. 2024, you're foolish. So again, no crystal ball, no prophecies, but we're foolish if we don't at least think of possibilities, reasonable possibilities. It is not going to be a smooth year. It is going to be a crazy year. But what I want to say is, here's a little bit of a white pill Wednesday. When I say it's going to be a crazy year, I don't mean it's all bad. I think there's going to be some awesome positive. So I've got some predictions, but let's start with you guys. Black swan events, and then also some positive predictions. Let's talk about it.
I do want to say, when we're thinking about black swan events, and I have one potential, but in general, in my opinion, they fall into two categories, and both are an appeal to emotion. One is an appeal to fear, like COVID was, right? Stay home, don't go out, don't do anything, shut everything down, you're all going to die, right? That's an appeal to emotion, but specifically to the emotion of fear. The second one is an appeal to the emotion of empathy, right? And so that leads me to one that God forbid it happen, but since borders and nationalism are such an issue, I think it's possible that there could be some sort of disaster among immigrants here in America, right? Where some person is painted as a some sort of nationalist or even Christian nationalist who does violence towards immigrants, or some disaster at the border where a bunch of them die trying to cross, or of thirst out in the desert, something like that. And this gets used as an appeal to the emotion of empathy. See, if we just opened the border, if we were just giving them citizenship, if we were just giving them all the things that they needed or wanted, none of that would happen. And those of you who are voting in any way in a sort of nationalistic pride sense, you really should be not even just not voting, but should be marginalized and put on the fringes of society. So that's one I have.
That's good.
Yeah.
Wes?
I think it's important to remember, too, the margins we're talking about, they're really very small. It's really about 4 battleground states, and the deciding vote in those is probably under 100,000. I think in the last election it was something like 79,000.
It was less than that.
We're not talking about millions.
Yeah, it was
of
actually,
votes.
I thought it was like 76 or something. But when I ran the numbers again, it was actually 46. It was under 50,000 in terms of swings. So what you're talking, there were 7 primary swing states that were contested, close calls. And Biden, no, it was like 11 actually. And Biden got 7 out of the 11 or 12, something like that. It was like 10 to 12, and Biden got 7 of them. And out of the 7 that Biden got that turned blue, barely, if Trump had only gotten 4 of those, or it might have been 3, it was like 3 or 4 of those, then he would have won at the the presidency at the Electoral College. And those 3 or 4 states that he would have had to win, the margins and the popular vote of each of those states collectively was less than 50,000. So, and then to put just a little bit of more application on here, can't help myself, but I wrote a book called Fight by Flight, get out of California, commie California, but 6 million votes for Trump in California.
Right.
And so it was really close. California's coming around. Nope. 12 million for Biden. Not even close. But my point is 6 million votes for Trump in California. And to my shame, I was one of them because we left California in December of 2020. And so just absolutely, just flushing your vote down the toilet if you're voting for Trump, in California, or voting for, any conservative in California. But my point is, at the national level, outside of just the state, at the national level, it came down to 3 or 4 pivotal states, swing states, going for Biden, and collectively 50,000. So 6 million wasted votes for Trump in one state, namely California, and 50,000 is all you needed. Now 50,000, you take that, it's 4. Actually 1%, right? So 6,600,000 would be 10%, 60,000 would be 1. So less than 1%. If less than 1% of conservative Christian residents in California had chose to leave the state before November 2020 and move to one of these 3 or 4 states respectively and cast their vote there, you would have had a Trump presidency instead of a Biden presidency, even with all the shenanigans being played. You'd have 13 U.S. service members, very likely still living, that died in Afghanistan. You probably would not have Putin's invasion with Ukraine. Very likely would not have some of the stuff going on in the Middle East with Hamas and Israel. You would not have some of the policies that have been crammed down. I mean, it's in real terms, it would be more loving for our neighbors. And first, in triage, our neighbors here, because we are obligated to them first, American neighbors. But then also, we do live in God's universal neighborhood, right? The person on the other side of the planet is, in theological terms, my neighbor. Now, I have a first obligation to my wife as a neighbor, then some random woman who is also my neighbor, but this one's my wife, right? And then my kids, not all kids. I do have an obligation at some level to all kids, but especially my kids. And beyond that, I have a certain obligation to all countries, but first to my countrymen, to my kinsmen. And so all that being said, in terms of love for neighbor, ironically, even love for our global neighbors, right? So even the weak God's language of inclusivism, we'll hate America, but love, the Sudan. Well, ironically, it would have been better for Afghanistan, better for every single neighbor in the world if less than 1% of conservative 6 million voters in California had left and voted in one of these states, the whole world would have been more left. So
that leads right into what my guess would be for a Black Swan event would be entering some type of global conflict. Ukraine is looking like they're probably about to lose the war. There was EU talked to Zelensky and they essentially said, like, you need to be preparing for peace talks in the new year. And wartime presidents actually generally prove to be generally pretty popular. I think of George W. Bush during the War on Terror.
Actually, I think
he did 2 terms.
I think that a U.S. president has never been voted out of office during a war.
That's what I think as well.
Yep.
Didn't want to say it just in case I'm wrong.
I've read that.
But to enter, for example, the war in Ukraine, we have to do this to push back against Putin. And if you vote for this guy, if you vote for the Republican nominee, we're going to lose all the progress. The world's going to be crushed under an iron curtain again. That might be something. The Middle East, same thing. Like, we have to go in there and help out our neighbor. And this guy won't do it. I got your back. Vote for me. Forget, because I mean, the economy. You can't even campaign on that. You can't campaign on the economy, on infrastructure.
You mean if you're a Democrat?
Right.
Yeah.
If you're Biden, you can't campaign on those things. So what are you going to have to do? Some type of, like you mentioned, an empathy event, a disaster. Because again, all you need is 50,000, 100,000 to be safe. Individuals to stay home. They're reluctant voters.
Right.
Fine. I'll fill out the ballot. Margin's not high.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. So you need some kind of Black Swan event. Here's a couple of I'll throw out my predictions again. No crystal ball. I'm not prophesying here, but just things to look for. And I do think it matters not to scare people, but just for us to be innocent as doves, cunning as serpents, wise. We can't just go in a bunker for 2024 and the rest of our lives indefinitely. So live your life. But live it with courage, but also live it with wisdom and discernment. And so that's all I'm saying. But with that, I have a few. So one, you have COVID 2.0, some kind of medical thing.
Right.
Because here's the deal. So you got to think, again, as a generalist, you got to think, all right, what's going to be the play? The play is keep Biden, in the White House, or really keep whoever's behind Biden. I'm convinced. I think Biden has literally been dead for at least a couple of years now, and they just have like some kind of like robotronics that like a Roomba that causes him to barely move around the room. So, anyways, they don't even need him alive at this point. It's just like they've been putting lipstick on that corpse for a while. But keep the Dems in the White House, and so how do you do that? Well, you need. I'm just going to say it. You need the peanut gallery of the country to vote. That's how Democrats get in office, right? That's the only way. Democrats get in office by, I'm going to say it, women voting.
If you don't say it, I'll say it.
All right, women voting, the lowest IQ in the country voting, the poorest voting. Basically, you need the people who contribute the least, the people who are most emotional, the people who contribute the least, people who are here illegally, who aren't even citizens. You need the dredge of society to vote. That's how Democrats win elections. Because when people who care about the country vote, if only people who could care about the country could vote, we would have a Republican president always.
Yep.
Democrats cannot win without getting people across the border, without women voting, without one day I think there'll be a play to lower even the age of voting.
That's already been talked about.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. They need 14-year-old minority trans girls to vote to win an election, because that's the only person who has the intellectual capacity to think that it would be a good idea to vote for a Democrat. Period. So all that being said. The play is, it's an election year. Dems want to stay in office. They need the lowest of the low to vote. So you have to, what do you do? So thinking like a generalist here, what you do is you have to make it easier to vote. Mm-hmm. So whether it's COVID 2.0, hey, we can't go out because, we got to stop the spread. So you can't go in person, mail in. Mail in is easier than putting on pants, right? Putting on pants, that's something that people with jobs do, right? But, you don't have time to put on pants in the morning when you've got, a whole Netflix season to binge that day, and collect your unemployment check. So that person doesn't go out to vote. That person mails in a vote. And it's not just that it's easier to mail in than go in and vote. The mail in, here's the thing about the mail in is it allows, you don't even have to fill out the ballots, because the same same person who won't go, oftentimes that person won't even mail in their vote. But what it allows is for ballot harvesters to go around and go to an apartment complex where they can literally look at the building and say, I know that or go to funded housing, where I know every single one of these people are on welfare. And can I just, hey, you don't want Trump to be president, do you? That guy's a racist. Right, like Biden wants to unite the nation, and
they want to take away your benefits.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And he wants to take away your benefits. I'll take it for you. I just need you to sign. And so that's and that's not even including like actual machines, straight up, fraud. Miscounted fraud. And so my point is, what can we expect this year? Anything that would make it. So this is the key. Anything that would make give some kind of logical reason, justification for not going in person, in public to vote. So disease can do that. Here's another one: mass shootings. Right. So FBI, just playing this out again. I'm not prophesying. This is literally just a random example. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but FBI, right, which we know is totally legit. But like FBI, they say, well, we've gotten a bunch of we hacked into a signal thread, or a bunch of emails that we came across where there's alt-right wing Nazi extremists that have said they're going to be shooting up voting booths, and so. And then we disclose which voting booths, but it's three or four voting booths.
Could be in these 4 states.
And these, exactly. In this
Georgia,
state, Pennsylvania,
Michigan.
and Michigan, and exactly. These coincidentally, conveniently, and so what we have to do is in these states, we have to, because this is the play. It's always public safety for individual liberty. Public safety for individual.
Give up being traded.
Exactly, that's the trade, right? So cost benefit analysis. It's give us your individual liberty. We'll provide your public safety. Yeah. So in those states, I'm sorry, but for the safety of the public, you guys get it, right? We're just looking out for the safety of the public. We're going to have to do all mail-in voting this year. No voting booths, no in-person. And then lo and behold, all the DNC little henchmen come out and they're doing the ballot harvesting. So shootings, medical COVID 2.0, both of those are easy. So that's what I would be thinking. Now with that, there actually could be some real shootings.
Sure.
Some real shootings. So like I already told my wife, again, living with courage, but also not living with a tinfoil hat, but also not living foolishly. And so I've already told my wife, hey, this year we're going to be a little bit more careful. We're probably in 2024, the way our nation is right now, and with it being an election year, we're probably not going to go to large public events. This is not a year for us to go to some big concert, as an example, or to this or that, because I see this as being, it's been happening for a while now. Some transgender, shooter shoots up a Christian school or something like, but especially this year. So this year, we're gonna play it a little closer to the chest. We're gonna be a little bit safer. We have our friends, our community. We'll do play dates, go to people's homes and do this, but probably not going to go to a large public event with multiple thousands of people there in the year 2024. So, anyways, what do you think, Wes?
No, that's great. And you got to think of it. At the end of the day, it's not a physical war, it's not a civil war, but there's a very sense in which we're at war for the soul of the West. And it's going to take sacrifice, and it's going to take hard work and diligence. So first ordering your home rightly, and then working to order your church and your community. But that's going to take, no, we're actually not going to go to the water park. We're not going to go to these concerts. Going to take personal sacrifice to fight for the soul of the West. We'll see what happens. The Lord knows. The Lord could bring revival. He even used flawed men like Donald Trump to just invigorate and stir up the will of the people for good. So God can use Donald Trump, and we may see a great renewal in this land. But it's going to take so many individual households making sacrifices, exactly like you said, to bring their wife home, to have children, to have a job, to work hard, all at a local level.
Lead family worship.
To bring into something more.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. And
because the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that